Hello friends, thanks for joining me today. So I have a lot of books that I managed to read for the month of June, so for the sake of time I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So the first book that I finished was the audiobook for The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller and narrated by Fraser Douglas. And I think that this was a great format to go with for this book, similar to how I listened to Circe as an audiobook, and I thought that Circe was great. I really enjoyed it. I think I gave it 4 stars. And I think that I would have enjoyed both of these books by Madeline Miller less if I had read physical copies, actually. A Song of Achilles is essentially a retelling of the Iliad, which is a very famous Greek epic poem about the Trojan War and the warrior hero Achilles. And this is told from the perspective of a man named Patroclus, who is Achilles' dearest friend and lover. And you follow them as they grow up together as young boys, and then through their lives as grown men. And basically prophecy says that Achilles is fated for greatness but also tragedy, so that knowledge hangs over both of their heads as they go to war against the Trojans, and that war lasts like a decade. I did enjoy this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I think it might be more like 3.5 for me, but I decided to round up for Goodreads. I've heard a lot of hype about this book, and the prose was very beautiful and poetic, which is fitting because this is based off of an epic poem, but the dialogue is very flat, and aside from Patroclus, there is very little depth to the characters, honestly, aside from surface level traits, and that includes Achilles himself. I think the audiobook is really great, and it gave this a boost in that regard because the narrator was able to put more emotion and personality into the dialogue than you would get from reading it yourself. The book was full of beautiful descriptions of Patroclus's feelings for Achilles, and I know that people just fawn over their romance. It's just a really hyped book in like the romance community and like the LGBTQ community, and it was lovely in its own way, but it was also sort of surface level, really. If you look, beneath the stunning verbiage, like you don't really know why they like each other. Like maybe proximity, growing up together. Achilles is described as, of course, very attractive and strong, and also kind of naive and idealistic for a lot of the book, which can be likable things, likable traits. But as for like Patroclus, not even joking, I think the only descriptor we get of Patroclus from Achilles' point of view is when Achilles calls him surprising, I think is the word he uses. How flattering. I just would have liked to get to know Achilles for more than just his deeds and reputation and just his loyalty to his lover. You get a look into ancient Greek social structures and priorities, which was interesting. But of course, women are treated like objects, basically. So, that's fun. So again, I did enjoy this. I liked it. I just would have loved more character development and more lively dialogue, but the narrator, does a good job of reading the dialogue in a way that's interesting. And this was, the book was purposefully written, I'm sure, in a way to sort of reflect the feel and style of the original epic, but be able to tell it to a modern audience. So I appreciate and understand the way that it was written. It's just not my favorite style of writing in terms of, character dialogue and actual characterization of the characters. And I finished a lot of audiobooks this month, actually, and the next book that I finished was an audiobook that was kind of on the shorter side, and that was The House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward and narrated by Christopher Ragland. This is a horror thriller following a few people that all live in the same house. There's a man named Ted who is a loner, drinks too much, and has, gaps in his memory and has a hard time discerning what's the present and what's the past. There's a young girl who isn't allowed to go outside, and there is a cat who is devout and gets guidance from the Bible. She's a great character, and they're all tied together somehow, and when a new neighbor moves in, there are old secrets hidden in the forest that are at risk of being unburied. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. This was really intense. It was very dark, very horrifying, very uneasy feeling, very sad. I really can't say too much about this without spoilers, truly. But there's more to this than you might think as it goes on, and I would urge you, if you choose to read this, not to DNF it, if possible. You will not get the full picture if you don't finish the book. I would give some trigger warnings for this book. There's death, there is abuse, and I can totally understand how people might be turned off by this or feel very icky or disturbed reading it. I had that feeling at times too, but this was so enthralling, horrifying, and sad. I have spoiler thoughts in my Goodreads review, which I will link in the description like I do with all the books I read. It was a lot. It was very twisted. I had so many feelings running through me while listening to this. I do highly recommend the audiobook. The narrator was incredible. And again, I don't want to say too much because it will spoil stuff, but there is a trope that I know some people don't like when authors use it in this way. I haven't read a whole lot of books that use this sort of narrative trope, but I think that this was used in a way that's maybe, it wasn't done in a bad way. It's really hard to explain without spoiling this, but I think it's important. It's a really interesting and important thing to be aware of if you weren't already aware of it. And I'm just gonna leave it there. It's a lot, so yeah, go into it just with those in mind. This definitely makes it into like my top favorite books of the year. If you enjoy, dark thrillers that leave you feeling uneasy while reading, highly recommend this. Really, really enjoyed it. Then finally, I finished a physical book, so now I can actually hold something up. So I finished the 5th book in the Throne of Glass series, which is Empire of Storms by Sarah J. Maas. This is a YA fantasy series following a young and beautiful assassin named Selena Sardothian, who is forced into this tournament to become the king's champion and work for him. And you follow her through this competition, and this is in book 1. Don't want to spoil anything after. So she goes through this competition and she discovers that something more sinister is going on that is a threat to the realm. Things get a lot more complicated with each book, as of course you might expect. It's a pretty classic modern YA fantasy series, and I can't go into much without spoiling previous books, but I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. And at this point, as a heads up if you haven't read this already, so the series evolves and changes quite a lot from the first 2 books. The first 2 books are really nothing like what the rest of the series is at this point, and I'm still very interested in the plot of the series. I want to see what happens, but in this book, honestly, most of the characters were getting in the way of my enjoyment of it, the way they act. All the main characters are getting paired together romantically for no discernible reason, which I don't think is necessary, and that includes my favorite character, named Madeline, who truly did not need a romantic partner, in my opinion. Everyone is constantly snarling and growling at everyone else. So there are Fae in the series, they play a big role, and Fae are all portrayed as being very strong and territorial and dramatic. As of now, I have read basically no books with fae in them. I think the only exception to that is the fae character in Patrick Rothfuss's Way of Kings series, the second book. There's a big kind of fae presence in there, and that's the only other fae I've read in books. And so maybe the real problem here is that I personally just don't love YA books centered around fae of this type. So I totally can see how people could enjoy it, and I just don't think I do. The characters were all just a bit much to deal with. I enjoy the story, and I'm excited to see how everything wraps up in the end, but I just wasn't a big fan of how a lot of the romantic stuff played out, and there was a lot of romantic stuff, and just the way the characters acted was like practically cringy to me. Didn't love it as much as I've loved others in the series. I am curious to give other YA books with fae in them a try to see if it's just, you know, kind of a genre thing, or if it's just the way that Sarah J. Maas portrays fae. I have, for instance, The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, and I know that that also has fae and romance, so we'll see how I enjoy that. So yeah, I've just heard that fae in modern YA fantasy are typically portrayed in this sort of way, so perhaps I just don't like stories with fae in them. We will see. Then I finished another audiobook, and it's called The Cat Who Saves Books by Sosuke Natsukawa, and this was translated from Japanese, and this is a fairly short modern fantasy following a boy named Rintaro who recently lost his grandfather. He passed away, and Rintaro inherits a small bookshop from his grandfather, and he loves reading. He's very timid, antisocial. If you haven't heard the phrase, he is what's called a hikikomori in Japan, who is basically someone who's just a complete social recluse. And one day, this talking cat appears in his bookshop asking for his help to save books that have been imprisoned and mistreated. So you follow him and this cat through these labyrinths that are magically hidden within the shop as he faces opponents who mistreat books. So first off, I have to say that the cover art for this is beautiful. I would get a print of this and put it up in my house. It's so cute, and I just love that classic Japanese, is it called woodblock art? I don't know exactly how to describe this style, but I absolutely love it. It's so cute. I love the cover. And I wanted to love this book about books, but I ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars. The premise is great, but the problems that each villain embodies surrounding books feel mostly to me like non-problems. That, or the author is trying to say that there is a right way to enjoy books. For instance, some of the morals taken from facing the very first opponent are, if you don't reread books over and over again, that's a terrible crime. If your books still look brand new after you finish reading them, then you're reading wrong. One of the opponents is a man who takes scissors to books to cut out the majority of it so people can like speed read. And like obviously like a lot of these are caricatures, but I don't think that this is an urgent growing problem in the reading space, like that a deluge of people are only reading books via super short summaries. Like I'm sure that there are people who do this, they exist, and I mean, they can do whatever they want, I suppose. But I just don't feel like that's this giant big problem that needs to be fixed. And another villain focuses on the publishing industry, which I felt, was kind of the most valid in terms of criticism, but I don't think it focused on the most critical things. And the book just comes across as elitist and paternalistic. Rintaro's arguments were a lot of him just reiterating how much he loves books and his own feelings about it. There were moments where some good points were made by both the villains and Rintaro. I liked the cat character. He's a tabby cat. He doesn't have a name, he's just the tabby, I think. Actually, I'm gonna have to double check if he has a name. I think he might have just been called, you know, the tabby. I think the book was a good length. It was pretty short, but for the most part, I was disappointed with this. I wasn't convinced of the prevalence of a lot of the problems that were being presented, and maybe it's a cultural difference because this was translated from Japanese, but yeah, it was a bummer. Then I read Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I love everything about this cover. I love everything about this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, one of my favorite books I've read so far this year. And the tagline of this book is a novel of high fantasy and low stakes. And it just describes this perfectly. So this takes place in a Dungeons and Dragons-like fantasy town, and you're following an orc named Viv, who has decided to retire from her life as a barbarian adventurer to settle down and open up her own coffee shop. And 95% of this book is just following her as she does this. She meets people along the way as she fixes up this old building, hires some of those people to work in her shop. She discovers new items to put on her menu, just living her dream. There are a couple things threatening her new business, and there's this special magical object that might be influencing the direction of things and is clearly going to be involved in an eventual, you know, conflict, culmination. But most of this is just cozy and charming and wonderful. You get a great sense of who all the characters are, even though you don't go super in depth with most of them. You just know who they are as characters, and it's just so easy to fall in love with them. There is a very subtle and sweet sapphic romance between Viv and Tandri, who is a succubus. And even if you aren't a huge fantasy reader, or if you don't play D&D, like, if this sounds interesting at all, please check it out. It was so good. Some people will be bored by the concept of it, and normally I would be one of those people in general. I don't usually enjoy just slice of life things, and this is super slice of life. So if the premise sounds utterly uninteresting to you, then I would avoid it. But just something about the combination of the concept, the setting, the characters, and vibe just formed this cozy story that I loved, and I can just see myself coming back to it if I want something simple and comforting to read. It's also really short. Almost exactly 300 pages, but the typeface is very large, so it's not super small. This is a really, really quick read. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting the author at a book signing at my local Barnes & Noble. He was there with his wife, and they were both so sweet and nice. He signed my book. I asked him about a question that he answered on Goodreads just a couple months ago about if there will be another book in this vein or this series, and he said that he intends to write, or he maybe is writing, at least one more book that takes place in the same city but features different characters, and he said it will be some sort of cozy mystery vibe. And I am just so hyped for it. I'll definitely be keeping my eyes and ears open for when that comes out. This was also picked up for publication by Tor, which is so cool. But I'm very happy that I have the original, indie print run. This is from Cryptid Press, and I definitely still want to pick up the Tor edition when it comes out. He said it will have some sort of snippet of some other story at the end, something like that. So yeah, I just adored this. 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Ivory Key by Akshaya Raman, which is an Indian-inspired fantasy, the first in a duology, and it takes place in the land of Ashoka, which was once full of magic, which in this world is a physical mineable resource that's used to infuse objects and enchant them to do different things, but the last available quarry of this resource is finally running dry, and the Maharani of this kingdom, named Vera, is desperate to replenish her kingdom's magic stores to protect her people from an impending war. And there's this legendary object called the Ivory Key that's said to be able to unlock these hidden quarries of magic across the land that have been locked away for centuries, and it's Vera's last hope to save her people. She has 3 siblings who each end up wanting to get their hands on the key for their own reasons, and they have to come together to try and find it. This is heavily focused on the dynamic and relationship between the siblings, as well as a lot of setup leading into the actual search for the key. I got this in an owl crate, and I had pretty low expectations for this going in, and I was pleased to find that it exceeded them for sure. I actually enjoyed this quite a bit. I would say it's like maybe 3.5 out of 5 stars, but because I just had a good time reading it overall, I am bumping it up to 4 for Goodreads. I didn't expect to enjoy the sibling drama and relationships dynamics the way that I did. Honestly, I was expecting to be bored with that aspect of it, to be honest, but I just found that I liked reading about how each sibling felt and thought about the others in the family. Each of the 4 siblings are very distinct people with distinct personalities and motivations, even though we only go, so deep into each of them. The latter part of this book is like an Indiana Jones style adventure with all these dangerous traps and puzzles that they have to overcome and solve to reach their goal. Some of the puzzles felt a little underwhelming, but it was still fun, and this was a pretty fast read, I found. Maybe not necessarily fast-paced for the first part. If you don't like character-driven stories, you'll probably find the first part of this to be slow, and then it picks up. The immediate setting felt very rich, and I enjoyed all of the Googling of foods and other cultural things that I wasn't familiar with, even though the actual broader world building is pretty light. You don't know too much about, the world at large. The magic system is pretty vague, but the sequel promises a heavy focus on the magic, so I'm looking forward to that. Overall, I just enjoyed my time reading this, even though, objectively, it wasn't, that amazing or groundbreaking. I still had a fun time with it, and right now I am interested in reading the second book. We'll see how I feel, by the time it actually comes out, but I enjoyed this. Then I actually finished a trilogy. So this is Girls with Rebel Souls by Suzanne Young, and it's the last book, the third and final book in the Girls with Sharp Sticks series. So obviously I can't talk very deeply about this without spoilers. In the first book, you're following these girls who attend Innovations Academy, which is a place where girls go to get an education in how to be the perfect girl. So it has classes of, how to be polite and beautiful and obedient, how to garden and etiquette, stuff like that. It's very sinister, and the girls start to realize that the academy isn't what it actually claims to be. You're following a lot of the same characters in this last book, and it's the culmination of all the things that they uncover. The first book, Girls with Sharp Sticks, was incredible, 5 stars, amazing, another one of the best books I've read this year. And then book 2 was so disappointing. I gave it 2 stars, and this book I'm also giving 2 stars. Maybe. Hello. So as you can see, I think my camera overheated or something because I lost a couple minutes of footage. So I was talking about the finale of Girls with Sharp Sticks series, and I was in the middle of saying that maybe I would give this a 2.5, maybe if I'm feeling generous, but I rounded down for Goodreads for it. I have a lot of the same critiques of this that I gave book 2. and I'll link the monthly wrap-up where I talked about it. The subtleness and the creepiness that book one managed just wasn't there in this book. The dialogue was boring, and it was very, this happened, and then we did this, and then this happened, and we thought this about it, and then this happened. It just came across as very matter of fact. The characters were only ever reacting to things happening. They weren't super proactive, it felt like, or they were constantly being too late to do anything. And it was very anti-men, once again, like book two came across as, which isn't constructive in the conversation about misogyny and the toxic patriarchy. And the ending was also very anticlimactic. It was a big disappointment. I still highly recommend book one as a standalone. I think it stands just fine on its own. You don't need to read the last two to enjoy the first one. And honestly, I am planning to unhaul books 2 and 3. They're taking up space on my shelf. I never want to read them again. I'm not interested. And I will just keep book one because book one was awesome. 5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that was that one. And then I finished another audiobook, which was Axis by Robert Charles Wilson, narrated by Scott Brick. This is the second book in the Spin trilogy, which is an adult sci-fi series, and I would definitely spoil things if I talk too in detail about this, but in the first book, you follow humanity in the wake of this global life-changing event. Basically, one night, without warning, the stars in the sky completely go out. They disappear. And humanity quickly learns that it's because some sort of shell has encased the Earth. No one knows who put it there, or why it's there, or how it got there. And the book basically follows life in the wake of what they call the spin. Book one was very character driven and a slow burn, and the second book was more plot driven and faster paced. And it was also a lot shorter than book one, which was kind of nice. This book also had more of an alien presence than book one had, which for me was inherently more interesting. Even though I loved book one and I gave book one 5 stars, I also gave the second book 5 stars. I was engrossed the whole time. I like the author's writing style. It's actually very beautiful, kind of lyrical at times, and this book just made me think about the nature of consciousness and how insignificant humanity is in the face of the universe. I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to read the third and final book called Vortex. I read the blurb for it and just, can't wait. So finally, we've reached the end. The final book I read this month was an Owl Crate book as well, called Only a Monster by Vanessa Len. This is a contemporary fantasy following a half Chinese, half English girl named Joan, who is spending her summer with her mom's side of the family in London, and she learns the truth that she is also half monster on her mom's side, and the boy she really likes turns out to be the legendary human hero destined to destroy all monsters, kill all monsters. So she struggles with her feelings for him while at the same time suddenly becoming sworn enemies, and she has to work with other monsters to find a way to stop the hero from killing her and her kind. This was a bit lackluster for me. I would give it maybe 2.5 stars maybe, but I rounded down to 2 for Goodreads. I don't often actively dislike main characters, but I was real close with Joan. She felt very immature and reckless, constantly talking over people or interrupting people in conversation. The romance between her and the hero, Nick, wasn't convincing, and fate plays into a lot of it, which felt very cheap and kind of like a cop-out. Also kind of random. Sorry if you hear my stomach grumbling at all. This microphone can be very sensitive, and I haven't had lunch yet, and it's late afternoon, so apologies if you're hearing anything in the background. I wasn't invested in any of the characters. There is time travel in this book, which surprised me and is tricky to play around with because of paradoxes and issues with continuity. Some of that is addressed, but also you just have to ignore things that shouldn't be that would be a problem in order for it to even work. I wasn't overly impressed with how time travel stuff was done here. There is rivalry between various monster houses, which was kind of entertaining. I liked that part of it, but I didn't like the ending. It reminded me strikingly of the way that the Queen of the Tearling series ended. So the end of book 3, The Fate of the Tearling by Erica Johansson. Curious if anyone else has actually finished that series. Let me know in the comments if you've read all 3 and what you thought of the series overall, and especially the last book. But I hated how that series ended, and this was a lot like that. It reminded me a lot of it. It's actually going to be the first book in a series, and I'm not going to be continuing, not interested, but I do like the cover. I think it looks very cool. So that is it for my June monthly wrap-up. I finished a lot of audiobooks, so I ended up reading a lot this month, which was great, and making progress through my Owl Crate book backlog. I've actually been reading, like, every other book has been an Owl Crate book because I need to get through them, and I found a couple good ones and then a couple not so good. So thank you so much for joining. I thought it was a pretty productive reading month. Read a lot of audiobooks, which has been great, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!